All right. So for this week, we'll start out with the Chapter 7 Just Mercy quiz and focus on Birmingham on Monday again. The third part of the speech, which I'll read momentarily. Then Tuesday, knock out the vocabulary quiz and read Chapter 8 in class. And that quiz will be Wednesday. And then when I see y'all on Thursday, B-Day group, we will read Chapter 9 together and then take a look at this article about the good cop. And then Friday, knock out the Chapter 9 quiz and take a look at Birmingham Part 4. So I'm just going to read these 3 things out loud for anyone who would like some auditory learning today. So we'll start with Birmingham Part 3. All right. So MLK has already focused on civil disobedience, specifically in response to the just and unjust law theory of St. Thomas Aquinas. So he will continue with that. Got some lovely allusions up here, and continue to respond to the ministers and their argumentation. Of course, there is nothing new about this kind of civil disobedience. It was evidenced sublimely in the refusal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar on the ground that a higher moral law was at stake. It was practiced superbly by the early Christians, who were willing to face hungry lions and the excruciating pain of chopping blocks rather than submit to certain unjust laws of the Roman Empire. To a degree, academic freedom is a reality today because Socrates practiced civil disobedience. In our own nation, the Boston Tea Party represented a massive act of civil disobedience. We should never forget that everything Adolf Hitler did in Germany was legal, and everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. It was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in Hitler's Germany. Even so, I am sure that, had I lived in Germany at the time, I would have aided and comforted my Jewish brothers. If today I lived in a communist country where certain principles dear to the Christian faith are suppressed, I would openly advocate disobeying that country's anti-religious laws. I must make 2 honest confessions to you, my Christian and Jewish brothers. First, I must confess that over the past few years I have been gravely disappointed with the white moderate. I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's greatest stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in the goal you seek, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, and who constantly advises the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will. Lukewarm acceptance is much more bewildering than outright rejection. I had hoped that the white moderate would understand that law and order exist for the purpose of establishing justice, and that when they fail in this purpose, they become the dangerously structured dams that block the flow of social progress. I had hoped that the white moderate would understand that the present tension in the South is a necessary phase of the transition from an obnoxious negative peace, in which the Negro passively accepted his unjust plight, to a substantive and positive peace, in which all men will respect the dignity and worth of human personality. Actually, we who engage in nonviolent direct action are not the creators of tension. We merely bring to the surface the hidden tension that is already alive. We bring it out into the open, where it can be seen and dealt with, like a boil that can never be cured so long as it is covered up, but must be opened with all its ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light. Injustice must be exposed, with all the tension its exposure creates to the light of human conscience and the air of national opinion, before it can be cured. In your statement, you assert that our actions, even though peaceful, must be condemned because they precipitate violence. But is this a logical assertion? Isn't this like condemning a robbed man because his possession of money precipitated the evil act of robbery? Isn't this like condemning Socrates because his unswerving commitment to truth and his philosophical inquiries precipitated the act by the misguided populace, in which they made him drink hemlock? Isn't this like condemning Jesus because his unique God consciousness and never ceasing devotion to God's will precipitated the evil act of crucifixion? We must come to see that, as the federal courts have constantly affirmed, it is wrong to urge an individual to cease his efforts to gain his basic constitutional rights because the quest may precipitate violence. Society must protect the robbed and punish the robber. I had also hoped that the white moderate would reject the myth concerning time in relation to the struggle for freedom. I have just received a letter from a white brother in Texas. He writes, all Christians know that the colored people will receive equal rights eventually, but it is possible that you are in too great a religious hurry. It has taken Christianity almost 2,000 years to accomplish what it has. The teachings of Christ take time to come to earth. Such an attitude stems from a tragic misconception of time, from the strangely irrational notion that there is something in the very flow of time that will inevitably cure all ills. Actually, time itself is neutral. It can be used either destructively or constructively. More and more, I feel that the people of ill will have used time much more effectively than have the people of goodwill. We will have to repent in this generation not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people. Human progress never rolls in on wheels of inevitability. It comes through the tireless efforts of men willing to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of social stagnation. We must use time creatively, in the knowledge that time is always ripe to do right. Now is the time to make real the promise of democracy and transform our pending national elegy into a creative psalm of brotherhood. Now is the time to lift our national policy from the quicksand of racial injustice to the solid rock of human dignity. You speak of our activity in Birmingham as extreme. At first, I was rather disappointed that fellow clergymen would see my non-violent efforts as those of an extremist. I began thinking about the fact that I stand in the middle of two opposing forces in the Negro community. One is a force of complacency, made up in part of Negroes who, as a result of long years of oppression, are so drained of self-respect and a sense of somebodyness that they have adjusted to segregation. And in part of a few middle-class Negroes who, because of a degree of academic and economic security, and because in some ways they profit by segregation, have become insensitive to the problems of the masses. The other force is one of bitterness and hatred, and it comes perilously close to advocating violence. It is expressed in the various black nationalist groups that are springing up across the nation, the largest and best known being Elijah Muhammad's Muslim movement. Nourished by the Negro's frustration over the continued existence of racial discrimination, this movement is made up of people who have lost faith in America, who have absolutely repudiated Christianity, and who have concluded that the white man is an incorrigible devil. I have tried to stand between these two forces, saying that we need emulate neither the do-nothingism of the complacent, nor the hatred and despair of the black nationalist. For there is the more excellent way of love and nonviolent protest. I am grateful to God that, through the influence of the Negro Church, the way of nonviolence became an integral part of our struggle. If this philosophy had not emerged, by now many streets of the South would, I am convinced, be flowing with blood. And I am further convinced that if our white brothers dismiss as rabble-rousers and outside agitators those of us who employ nonviolent direct action, and if they refuse to support our nonviolent efforts, millions of Negroes will, out of frustration and despair, seek solace and security in black nationalist ideologies, a development that would inevitably lead to a frightening racial nightmare. Oppressed people cannot remain oppressed forever. The yearning for freedom eventually manifests itself, and that is what has happened to the American Negro. Something within has reminded him of his birthright of freedom, and something without has reminded him that it can be gained. Consciously or unconsciously, he has been caught up by the zeitgeist, and with his black brothers of Africa and his brown and yellow brothers of Asia, South America, and the Caribbean, the United States Negro is moving with a sense of great urgency toward the promised land of racial justice. If one recognizes this vital urge that has engulfed the Negro community, one should readily understand why public demonstrations are taking place. The Negro has many pent-up resentments and latent frustrations, and he must release them. So let him march. Let him make prayer pilgrimages to the city hall. Let him go on freedom rides, and try to understand why he must do so. If his repressed emotions are not released in nonviolent ways, they will seek expression through violence. This is not a threat, but a fact of history. So I have not said to my people, get rid of your discontent. Rather, I have tried to say that this normal and healthy discontent can be channeled into the creative outlet of nonviolent direct action. And now this approach is being termed extremist. But though I was initially disappointed at being categorized as an extremist, as I continued to think about the matter, I gradually gained a measure of satisfaction from the label. Was not Jesus an extremist for love? Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you. Was not Amos an extremist for justice? Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Was not Paul an extremist for the Christian gospel? I bear in my body the marks of the Lord Jesus. Was not Martin Luther an extremist? Here I stand. I cannot do otherwise, so help me God. And John Bunyan, I will stay in jail to the end of my days before I make a butchery of my conscience. And Abraham Lincoln, this nation cannot survive half slave and half free. And Thomas Jefferson, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. So the question is not whether we will be extremists, but what kind of extremists we will be. Will we be extremists for hate or for love? Will we be extremists for the preservation of injustice or for the extension of justice? In that dramatic scene on Calvary's Hill, 3 men were crucified. We must never forget that all 3 were crucified for the same crime, the crime of extremism. 2 were extremists for immorality and thus fell below their environment. The other, Jesus Christ, was an extremist for love, truth, and goodness, and thereby rose above his environment. Perhaps the South, the nation, and the world are in dire need of creative extremists. All right. So, 2 questions based on this section. So, throughout the speech, primarily at the beginning and the end, Martin Luther King uses a variety of historical allusions, and they add a lot of legitimacy and a lot of rhetorical persuasiveness to his argument. So, why don't you talk about, how they do that, and specific ones, and, what they kind of add to his argument, making those references. And then the white moderate. So even though normally we would never say that, anything could be more harmful to social and racial progress than forces such as the KKK, why does Martin Luther King say that the white moderate might even actually top that? Why might the white moderate be more dangerous to the cause that he is trying to carry out? All right, so that's part 3. Carrying on, let's see, there's a quiz and another quiz. All right, so for B-Day folks, we'll read this together in class, but A-Day folks, if you would like to hear me talk about the good cop and the culture of policing in our country, this is connected to Chapter 9, which is why I situated it right after Chapter 9. There are a couple of law enforcement officials mentioned in that chapter who suffered a similar outcome to the individual in this article. So the individual in question, Ryan Adler, his legal battle was back in 2015, but this article was published more recently to try and kind of call attention to this idea that, well, the only way bad cops get away with things is if good cops don't speak up and stop them. And, talking about how hard it is to do that in certain areas in certain police departments, maybe all over the place. In fact, it's hard to be the one speaking out, and sometimes there's consequences for trying to do the right thing in the police department. So, title is The Dilemma of the Good Cop: Calling Out Wrongdoing Can End an Officer's Career. During his decade-long career in law enforcement, Ryan Adler said he witnessed racism, homophobia, and excessive bullying among his fellow officers in the Redwood City Police Department. But when he decided to speak up, he was labeled a rat and a snitch and was eventually forced out of the department. The real problem that we have right now is that we have a system that does not allow good cops to come forward, Adler said. You have a system where if you complain, you're ostracized and you're shunned, and you might not get cover on that next call when you need help. For example, nearly a decade ago, Adler said that an officer would talk about colleagues being thrifty and then call them effing Jews. Adler said the same officer, who has now been promoted to sergeant, would intimidate him by clicking an unloaded gun near the back of his head to scare him. He would take his gun out of the holster and stand behind me, Adler said, and he would rack the slide, and he would dry fire, and it would go click. Another time in 2011, Adler said his colleagues went on a domestic violence call. The woman was crying about how her husband cheated on her. The officers thought that was funny and made an audio clip of her crying. Adler said the officer then emailed the clip to everyone on the shift so that they could turn her weeping voice into a ringtone. Adler said he didn't speak up at this point because it was early in his career. When you're in a situation and you want to speak up, it's hard to know when to do it, he said. You learn really quickly that there are things you can talk about and things you can't. We were expected to accept it or chuckle with this inner circle of officers. Finally, Adler said he couldn't take it anymore. In 2013, he went to Human Resources, where the day after he complained, he was told he'd have to go on medical leave, even though he had been working as a detective with a slightly injured shoulder for months before that. He eventually sued the department in federal court for retaliation, saying he was essentially forced out of his job. He received a $150,000 settlement in 2015. And while these examples all happened years ago, Adler said he is speaking up now as heightened focus is being paid to reforming police departments across the country in the wake of the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. Redwood City is far from the only city in the country whose police force has faced similar accusations of bigotry, sexism, and toxic masculinity. And while these behaviors are usually not criminal, both reform advocates and police chiefs alike say they are indicative of officers' attitudes and prejudices towards others and the wider community that they serve. Adler said he believes his insights as a former officer, one who was maligned for calling out injustices, can help bring light to these systemic cultural problems, especially as leaders are vowing that they too want change. The timing is right to speak now, he said. Adler is not the only officer who has complaints with the department. After speaking with 16 sources for this story, some other examples include: one retired police officer said it was routine for a colleague to take out his penis in the locker room and shove his head close to it. He also said that the same officer would wrap his penis around his wrist and ask his friends if he liked his watch. When the officer said he spoke up and told his colleagues to stop it, he said that officer made fun of his ethnicity and told him he liked to F little boys. He finally complained to his supervisor. The solution, he said, was that the supervisor told the offending officer not to tell the penis jokes in front of him because he was too sensitive. And so the offending officer continued his behavior only in front of others. That officer is still a member of Redwood City PD, but is out on medical leave, according to a call made to the department. Another former officer said that a high-level commander would routinely make racist and homophobic comments. Some years back, there was a foul smell at a Citizens Academy meeting of mostly Latino community members. The high-level commander was heard saying, "Don't worry, they're used to the smell." The former officer said he reported this to superiors, and was brushed off. Maggie Alava, a former Redwood City police dispatcher, said she regularly heard some officers call Latinos chicken breath as a way to make fun of Hispanic accents. In Spanish, that sounds just like she can't breathe, which some people say quickly if, let's say, they are in an accident, Alava explained. It's so disgusting, but so normal. They said it my whole career. She also said that she spoke to supervisors about the regular office gossip about her sexual life, but she said nothing happened. So she stopped reporting the behavior. What am I going to do? She asked rhetorically. They're just going to laugh it off. Alava is glad she doesn't work there anymore. She was fired, then won her job back, and ultimately quit. If you have a good heart, you don't fit in, she said. You don't belong there. Ryan Adler was a good guy. He was educated. He didn't treat people this way. I also didn't fit in. We did not fit into their culture. Janine Maycroft, a former Redwood City police officer who is now a private investigator, has a current beef with several police officers, including her ex-husband, whom she accuses of abusing his power for personal gain during an ongoing child support battle last November. In police reports, her ex's colleagues stated they arrived on scene to help the couple sort out some issues during a routine civil standby last November to help out during a familial conflict. But Maycroft says what happened was far from routine. She said that when she went to pick up her child, her ex's colleagues told her that her daughter had called 911 because she didn't want to go home with her and instead wanted to go home with her father. However, Maycroft provided phone records to KTVU showing her daughter never called 911 that day. She believes they intervened and outright lied to her. Maycroft said she went to the district attorney's office to file charges, but the case never went anywhere. She hasn't gone to file an internal affairs complaint because the captain that oversees those investigations is the same one who signed off on the civil standby in her personal situation. I'm afraid to speak up, that they'll retaliate against me, she said. You just don't open your mouth. It's not worth it. Her ex-husband did not respond to her request for comment. In an interview, Redwood City Police Chief Dan Mulholland declined to comment on Adler's case or the specifics of any of the other allegations. And KTVU is choosing not to identify any of the officers cited in these examples because there have been no criminal charges brought against them or sustained findings made public about their alleged behavior. But he said that he believes that officers in his department are clearly instructed of the rules, and if they are broken, they will be dealt with accordingly. Mulholland, who has been at the department for 37 years and chief since 2018, also insisted that law enforcement has gone a long way. We've progressed in the last 30 years right along with society. He asserted that in his department, folks are actually encouraged, if they have concerns, to bring them to the administration, or they can bypass mid-level and go directly to human resources. There is accountability at all levels. Since he took over the department 2 years ago, Mulholland said his officers must be above reproach. I have higher standards, he said. That goes for officers who see bad behavior and don't report it, he said. If they see something and they don't come forward, now they are being complicit, Mulholland said. If you turn a blind eye, it hurts all of us. He said he knows plenty of officers who never made it out of probation because they never rose above the frat or high school locker room where it's all fun and games. If someone shows any type of character flaw during the hiring process, they will not join the other roughly 90 other Redwood City police officers, he said. And if they don't get that, they should go somewhere else, Mulholland said. We need to be professional. If there is crossing the line, they'll be dealt with internally. If they don't get it, they'll be on a pathway to termination. Mulholland said he has personally put 2 or 3 officers on the pathway to termination during the 2.5 years he's been chief. He would not disclose how many times he has disciplined officers and for what, citing privacy laws. Although the Redwood City Police Department is not known for being a hotbed of police misconduct in a quiet Silicon Valley suburb where the median home price is $1 million, Adler's experience there was not uncommon, according to interviews with more than a dozen people, including 10 former members of the department. Redwood City is home to nearly 90,000 residents, about 30 minutes from San Francisco. This isn't just Redwood City, said Lodoris Cordell, a retired Santa Clara County judge and the city of San Jose's former independent police monitor. Don't kid yourself. It's sad, but this is not just at one department. It's throughout the entire country. Cordell pointed out that Adler's story illustrates the dilemma of the good cop. She said good officers really only have 3 options. They can speak out, but if they do, they will be pilloried by your own and forced out. 2, they can stay silent. Or 3, if they stand up for what they believe is right, they'll have to quit their career. Cordell also said it's a myth that police departments overall are full of good cops, and there are only 1 or 2 bad apples in each one. The problem lies in the culture of policing, she said. These are the unwritten rules that everyone understands. The culture can even make the good officers become bad because if they want to remain, they have to be silent, and then they're part of the problem. Other departments face pockets of racist cultures too. Just this month in San Jose, 4 officers were put on leave after some of their slurs against Muslims were spotted in a private Facebook group for current and former officers. No one spoke up about this within the department, however. The officers were outed anonymously in a blog post on Medium. Sonia Kutnak Ikvofich, a professor of criminal justice at Michigan State University, who co-wrote a paper on the Code of Silence with a grant from the U.S. Department of Justice, explained that police departments must hold bad cops accountable or the good ones will leave. The focus shouldn't be on the few bad apples, Ikovich said. Rather, the focus should be on the rotten orchard and whether the police department has systemic problems. If officers know the rules and that discipline will be meted out for not following them, then the code of silence will be less. To some, times have changed since Adler's era. I have seen in this administration under Mulholland that misconduct is adequately addressed, and there is not a culture from the top of covering up for bad actions, said David Stoller, a retired detective. Retired officer William Chris Wynn also said that his overall assessment was that this was a good place to work. Multiple officers told KTVU that despite Mulholland's good intentions, some of the problems still exist in Redwood City. While some of the old guard has left the department, many say Mulholland has not cleaned house swiftly enough. For instance, the officer referenced in Adler's lawsuit has been disciplined, multiple sources said, but he has also since been promoted to sergeant. But the department's own records raise questions as to whether Redwood City PD has held officers accountable. In 20 years of record keeping, Redwood City has never found any sustained allegations against officers who lied or were found guilty of sexual assault, two categories of behavior that are now public under the Transparency Law SB 1421, according to KTVU's review of the department records. Under current police transparency laws, allegations and findings of racism and demeaning sexual behavior do not have to be made public. A bill, SB 776, proposed by State Senator Nancy Skinner, would change that. The bill, introduced in June, seeks to provide access to all disciplinary records involving officers who have engaged in racist, homophobic, or anti-Semitic behavior or actions against any other protected class, as long as the complaints are not frivolous. The bill would also require access to these records, even when an officer resigns before the agency's investigation is complete. As for Adler, he implores any legislator to come up with a plan to make these records open to the public. For now, he hopes his story will shed some light on what he sees as the dark side of police culture and bring about much-needed change. I'm coming from a unique perspective, he said. I was a police officer for about 10 years, and I understand the inside of the system. But I also took it on and experienced the outside of the system. I understand how things are hidden, how things get covered up, how bad officers get retained. He said he first became a police officer because he is civic-minded, and that even though it's years later, he cares about his past career and wants there to be a bright future for policing. I got into this to make a difference, he said. All right, so if you have already read Chapter 9, I'm sure you can see some connections here, how officers who speak up and speak out and won't go along with corrupt behavior, sometimes suffer consequences. And, what do we do for these officers? How do we fix the police culture so that their goodness is rewarded? Because, they're the ones we really want in the police department, right? All right, so last thing is a letter from a Birmingham jail, part 4. So continuing from where Martin Luther King left off when he talked about being proud to be an extremist because he was in the company of such great ones throughout history. I had hoped that the white moderate would see this need. Perhaps I was too optimistic. Perhaps I expected too much. I suppose I should have realized that few members of the oppressor race can understand the deep groans and passionate yearnings of the oppressed race, and still fewer have the vision to see that injustice must be rooted out by strong, persistent, and determined action. I am thankful, however, that some of our white brothers in the South have grasped the meaning of this social revolution and committed themselves to it. They are still all too few in quantity, but they are big in quality. Some, such as Ralph McGill, Lillian Smith, Harry Golden, James McBride Dabbs, Anne Braden, and Sarah Patton Boyle, have written about our struggle in eloquent and prophetic terms. Others have marched with us down nameless streets of the South. They have languished in filthy, roach-infested jails, suffering the abuse and brutality of policemen who viewed them as dirty end lovers. Unlike so many of their moderate brothers and sisters, they have recognized the urgency of the moment and sensed the need for powerful action antidotes to combat the disease of segregation. Let me take note of my other major disappointment. I have been so greatly disappointed with the white church and its leadership. Of course, there are some notable exceptions. I am not unmindful of the fact that each of you has taken some significant stands on this issue. I commend you, Reverend Stallings, for your Christian stand on this past Sunday in welcoming Negroes to your worship service on a non-segregated basis. I commend the Catholic leaders of this state for integrating Spring Hill College several years ago. But despite these notable exceptions, I must honestly reiterate that I have been disappointed with the church. I do not say this as one of those negative critics who can always find something wrong with the church. I say this as a minister of the gospel, who loves the church, who was nurtured in its bosom, who has been sustained by its spiritual blessings, and who will remain true to it as long as the cord of life shall lengthen. When I was suddenly catapulted into the leadership of the bus protest in Montgomery, Alabama a few years ago, I felt we would be supported by the white church. I felt that the white ministers, priests, and rabbis of the South would be among our strongest allies. Instead, some have been outright opponents, refusing to understand the freedom movement and misrepresenting its leaders. All too many others have been more cautious than courageous and have remained silent behind the anesthetizing security of stained-glass windows. In spite of my shattered dreams, I came to Birmingham with the hope that the white religious leadership of this community would see the justice of our cause and, with deep moral concern, would serve as the channel through which our just grievances could reach the power structure. I had hoped that each of you would understand, but again, I have been disappointed. I have heard numerous Southern religious leaders admonish their worshippers to comply with a desegregation decision because it is the law, but I have longed to hear white ministers declare, "Follow this decree, because integration is morally right and because the Negro is your brother." In the midst of blatant injustices inflicted upon the Negro, I have watched white churchmen stand on the sideline and mouth pious irrelevancies and sanctimonious trivialities. In the midst of a mighty struggle to rid our nation of racial and economic injustice, I have heard many ministers say, "Those are social issues with which the gospel has no real concern." And I have watched many churches commit themselves to a completely otherworldly religion which makes strange, unbiblical distinction between body and soul, between the sacred and the secular. I have traveled the length and breadth of Alabama, Mississippi, and all the other southern states. On sweltering summer days and crisp autumn mornings, I have looked at the South's beautiful churches with their lofty spires pointing heavenward. I have beheld the impressive outlines of her massive religious education buildings. Over and over, I have found myself asking, what kind of people worship here? Who is their God? Where were their voices when the lips of Governor Barnett dripped with words of interposition and nullification? Where were they when Governor Wallace gave a clarion call for defiance and hatred? Where were their voices of support when bruised and weary Negro men and women decided to rise from the dark dungeons of complacency to the bright hills of creative protest? Yes, these questions are still in my mind. In deep disappointment, I have wept over the laxity of the church. But be assured that my tears have been tears of love. There can be no deep disappointment where there is not deep love. Yes, I love the church. How could I do otherwise? I am in the rather unique position of being the son, the grandson, and the great-grandson of preachers. Yes, I see the church as the body of Christ. But oh, how we have blemished and scarred that body through social neglect and through fear of being nonconformists. There was a time when the church was very powerful, in the time when the early Christians rejoiced at being deemed worthy to suffer for what they believed. In those days, the church was not merely a thermometer that recorded the ideas and principles of popular opinion, it was a thermostat that transformed the mores of society. Whenever the early Christians entered a town, the people in power became disturbed and immediately sought to convict the Christians for being disturbers of the peace and outside agitators. But the Christians pressed on, in the conviction that they were a colony of heaven, called to obey God rather than man. Small in number, they were big in commitment. They were too God-intoxicated to be astronomically intimidated. By their effort and example, they brought an end to such ancient evils as infanticide and gladiatorial contests. Things are different now. So often the contemporary church is a weak, ineffectual voice with an uncertain sound. So often it is an arch defender of the status quo. Far from being disturbed by the presence of the church, the power structure of the average community is consoled by the church's silent, and often even vocal, sanction of things as they are. But the judgment of God is upon the church as never before. If today's church does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authenticity, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning for the 20th century. Every day, I meet young people whose disappointment with the church has turned into outright disgust. All right, so a loving and harsh condemnation of the church there. So what I ask you specifically is the use of rhetorical questions. There are a pretty decent amount of them in this section as Martin Luther King is expressing his disappointment with the church. And then thinking about, the questions themselves, and not just the fact that they are questions, but the specific questions themselves. Why is that specific question, whichever one you've chosen to highlight in your response, why is that more effective than a statement would be? Why does that have more power? So, all right, and that is all for this week.